Very welcome, and I would like to start with to say that the Swedish Research Council is very happy to co-organize this pre-conference together with Professor Alex Gerber and his research team, but also with our colleagues at VA, Public and Science. It was an excellent opportunity that we could arrange this back-to-back with the main conference, which will take place tomorrow. I think it's important to try to bridge the gap between the researchers and practitioners in the field. How can we better align theory and practice? But also, how can we conduct more evidence-based science communication? I hope today's workshop is one step in that direction, and I'm very much looking forward to the final results. Just a little bit about the conference Forum for Science Communication. We started back in 2013, so it will be the 9th edition. And we are super excited that we have amazingly over 800 people registered for tomorrow. The aim of the conference is to provide participants with inspiration, new knowledge about tools and methods for science communication, and to offer the opportunity to network and exchange experience with each other. Over the years, we had national and international scientists and experts as speakers, and we have tried to cover contemporary topics, trends, and challenges. The organizers of the conference is 8 funding bodies in Sweden, together with VA, and is part of the Swedish International Science Festival. I hope you will enjoy the workshop today, and I hope to see you again tomorrow. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Anna Maria. And I must say it's very valuable for us, VA Public and Science as well, to be a part of this pre-conference workshop and the study, both as we are the national node for SciComm and public engagement in Sweden, but also for 100 member organizations in Sweden. And of course, the results from this workshop and study will be implemented and used in our forthcoming activities. Moreover, we also discovered that research in science communication is a relatively young and emerging research field in Sweden, and a brief mapping that we conducted at VA based on publications in 3 main journals of the field, the Journal of Science Communication, Public Understanding of Science, and Science Communication, by authors from Swedish institutions, shows that only 23 articles authored by a total of 28 unique researchers have been published since 2010. So we very much look forward to participating in the discussions today, and we also invite all of you to join the forum tomorrow, and of course the international get-together after the conference, the Eftersnack. So over to you, Alex, and let's get started.
Thank you very much indeed, also for the kind introduction. Also, a most warm welcome from my side. Thank you very much indeed for everyone to join. We are 38 colleagues now altogether. Considering that we have set up this workshop comparatively short notice, it's all the more encouraging to see that so many of you have actually decided to participate today. We have roughly 2 hours. You've just seen the agenda. I wanted to make a few introductory remarks first, and then look at the results from the survey, which you have kindly filled in, or at least many of you. My name is Alexander Gerber, Research Director at the Institute for Science and Innovation Communication, which is an extramural research institute in Germany, based in Germany. Also chair of the Science Communication Department at Rhine-Waal University, where we run an English-speaking SciComm degree program. You have my Twitter handle here, INSCICO, that's the institute. You will be seeing this link down here, sciencecom.science/the research field. I'll show that later again as well, which is where the research field analysis can be accessed both as a freely open access ebook and also as an audiobook. So we called this Pathways to Praxis for those like me, not necessarily capable of reading Latin or Greek, or being a philosopher, both of which is not the case. You may want to first of all ask yourself, why do we call this praxis? The term is usually defined as the process by which a theory is enacted or a theory is realized, an act of practicing an idea. And Aristotle, to whom we owe the term and the concept, also distinguished between a good and a bad praxis, which might also today inform how we look at it. Why did I choose a space picture here? Well, because some of you may be aware of the praxis effect, since you may be Googling it, just in case people will be asking you afterwards what you've done. So to contextualize it for those who are Trekkies among us today, Star Trek fans, Praxis was the name of a moon of the Klingons, which was destroyed in one of the 1991 episodes of Star Trek. It was the last one featuring this entire cast of the original series. And so this effect of, as you can see on the right-hand side, this kind of disk explosion is something that has been used in science fiction over and over and over again. Has very little, if nothing, to do with our topic today, but I thought it's important to share that this is also where normally in the field of science fiction and communication, praxis effects are also quite common. What you see here is an overview over the field analysis, which we're going through in the second part of our workshop today. What we want to do first is to look at the results of the survey. We didn't just want to invite everyone to an open discussion, but we wanted to discuss based on actual inputs from the community. In that case, community from the Nordic and Baltic countries primarily, but we have, I think, also colleagues joining us today from South Africa and other countries, which is fantastic. The survey was meant to inform our discussion. It's not meant as the utmost serious exercise in data collection yet, because obviously the sample size, the pre-testing, none of this could be done. Also, the inferential statistical analysis of the results wouldn't have been possible in whatever we had for 24 hours since data collection was finalized. For those who have not done the survey, it would be fantastic to also hear about your opinions, experiences, and attitudes after the session, after the workshop, obviously. So please don't hesitate to fill it in. We will take that then, of course, into account, because the data is different after the workshop than like post-workshop compared to pre-workshop. A note of explanation regarding the informed consent. There were quite a few, I think half a dozen colleagues who unfortunately understood the informed consent wrongly, and they opted in for being informed after the workshop about all kinds of activities of our institute, which is fantastic. Thank you very much for that. But they didn't check the box that they're actually also fine with them, with us using the data from their survey questionnaire. So a couple of results from those surveys. First question was, in which ways have you actually accessed science communication research in the past? Because you would normally expect that this would be journal papers, since what else would it be? But already hypothesizing that the world has changed, the digitization kicking in, and as you can already see down here, indeed, we have blog posts and videos, which even has led in the meantime to publishers offering video abstracts. It would be interesting to either discuss today or to investigate later whether those videos are, let's say, YouTube videos by well-known science YouTubers or by Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about how science communication is supposed to happen. I dared today to challenge him on Twitter. Let's see what happens then. Or whether these are actual videos by what we used to call hard blogging scientists. Similarly with the blog posts, are these something like the LSE Impact blog or the conversation where you read online about research, or is this by researchers sharing their work? Otherwise, as you can see, it's quite widely distributed between books, academic journal papers, and also gray literature. What was interesting, probably the most surprising, is when we ask how many times a year do you actually go through SciComm research. And the 12 here would mean that on average, every month, you guys would be reading about social research on science communication. That is 5 out of the 19 here at the moment. Then we have a block of people who do it much more irregularly, maybe like once a quarter around. So, and in the middle. But that high number of practitioners saying that they're basically looking at SciComm research on a monthly basis was very surprising. We have done an alpha test of this survey probably about 4 weeks ago at the National Irish Science Communication Conference, and that has shown different results. So maybe this is a part of a sample bias or selection bias, that those colleagues joining us today have such a high interest in the SciComm research because they have already dived into it and have discovered that there is a lot actually to learn from it, or not, or let's say have been exposed and want to share their frustration about it. So we'll have to see whether the participants at these workshops, whether the distribution is significantly different in later surveys that we're planning for colleagues that don't necessarily plan to take part in such a workshop. So that will be methodologically maybe an interesting question. Then something that was also core to the survey was that you were invited to express your agreement or disagreement with a couple of statements. One was, for example, do you think that you are aware of SciComm research that is relevant to your respective area of work, whether you work at a science museum or for a science festival or for a university PR department, you name it. And the awareness, as you can see, was rather low. So the majority of people saying no. I put here as a potential conclusion the known unknown. So maybe it is an awareness that there is something out there which could be potentially beneficial if I had access, if I were able to use it in practice. But it's a certain uncertainty that I feel in these responses. Comparable questions: is there enough research out there investigating my particular area of work? Well, as you can see, by far, most of the respondents have disagreed with that statement. So clearly more need for research, which immediately raises the question, so what kind of research would that be? And that's where our project, Pathways to Praxis, is starting, basically, that we want to learn more by asking the practitioner communities, by investigating that, by looking at the newsletters and so on. So what is their concern? What are their burning issues? And which of those would need to be addressed by research? The agreement here indicates, I think, also quite clear that most respondents think that it generally is relevant. It is quite interesting in these Likert scales here that the extreme values are, in general, in the survey, proportionally small. The strong agreement, the strong disagreement is something that the respondents here, those 19 colleagues, have usually not chosen. So in that case, it is an agreement that, yeah, it's kind of relevant. The question whether the research uses too much jargon, again, a hypothesis that even the researchers themselves had. Like in linguistics, we usually say that 98% of a text needs to be understood to actually fully comprehend its messages, whereas the proportion of jargon in academic writing is much higher than those remaining 2%. So you wouldn't have 98% of intuitively comprehensible text in an average social science research paper, but more something between 70 and 80%. So normally you would expect actually a layperson at least to struggle with that. The very strong actually disagreement with that statement shows that we might be, or we may have overestimated in our hypothesis the lack of willingness of the practitioners community to put up with the jargon. Furthermore, we also, of course, know that quite a few in the field in the meantime have some form of science communication training, so certain concepts, certain theories, certain methodologies are also, I think, well known. So that, again, is also quite a surprising result, as much as, of course, we may need to be careful with a sample size like that, and the sampling bias of doing it in such a workshop. Obviously, we need to be careful generalizing this too much, even for the Nordic-Baltic region. Is the research normally applicable? Could the research be applied to my area of work? Well, this is a bit more of a balanced result, many neutral results, probably quite undecided, might be an indication, if you want to speculate for a second, that this is something that people would need to see when exploring it further. Another hypothesis was that many people in practice may not have actual access to research published behind paywalls in closed access journals, which the main journals in our field actually are closed access. So you need a subscription as an institution, unless you want to pay whatever, $59 per article to read it. You guys disagreed quite fundamentally with that statement. So it's actually not much of an issue for you. Could be due to the fact that most of you seem to be working in RPOs, research performing organizations, often universities, which then have, if you're based on campus in the IP realm, you have access to those publications, even though you wouldn't normally be in those research teams. So that might be already one of the explanations, something that, again, may need to be rethought, reconsidered when we think maybe this isn't as much of a problem as it has been portrayed. Does the research fail to address the actual challenges you're facing practically in your area of work on a daily basis? Well, the majority either agreed that research fails to address those challenges or remain neutral. You see different survey items confirming a similar mindset or a similar attitude. Another statement that the survey respondents were asked to agree or disagree with was whether they imagine that scholars could use the data from some of their practice activities in order to do collaborative research. So instead of a scholar, a science communication researcher doing research on fictional scenarios or developing theoretical models and frameworks detached from an actual activity, why not actually use a science festival or the visitors of a science museum to explore certain behavioral or attitudinal aspects of how people engage with scientific content. And we were skeptical, actually, to be quite honest, whether we should include this survey item, but also in the alpha and beta tests, it showed that it is easier to understand than I originally thought. So interestingly enough, there is comparatively little uncertainties, but actually quite a strong agreement with that statement, saying, yeah, so I'm doing these practice activities here, and I would welcome if researchers approach me to use the data that I could be or am actually already producing, be it for evaluatory research or for pre-post studies or for even testing theoretical models and frameworks in practice. So that's something of the disconnect that is also distinctly different from just assuming that there is this body of research and we just need to absorb it by osmosis into practice. That's not how we, I think, should be discussing transfer, but it's more about talking about models of collaboration for research to tap the potential of doing the investigations together with the practitioners and what we still call action research quite a lot. So I'm almost through with the presentation. We also asked whether colleagues had looked at the field analysis, more technical question because we wanted to correlate whether those who have read our analysis that we published earlier last year on what has actually been researched over the last, 50 years in social sciences, whether they may have actually different attitude or come up with different needs and challenges than those who have not explored it. So that's more a technical question. A very important point here towards the end of that part of the presentation of our workshop was challenges that you're facing on a daily basis in your practice, from which we could deduce needs to do further research. The science communication research field analysis, which I've just mentioned, does that basically by researchers. So researchers researching how research may need to change in order to address practice needs better. I think it's even more important to ask the practitioners directly, say, so what is it that bothers you? Where would you need more support, more evidence, more clarity, more insight, more ideas. And we have clustered those challenges at the moment in 4 different bubbles. Let's start with the first 2 here. One we called audiences. I'm just reading it out. For one, trying to communicate to an uninterested or hostile audience, and the question how to engage on particular topics. For example, in that case, it was antibiotic resistance, but I suppose it could be almost any other topic. I will be talking about that, showing you a few statistics in about half an hour when we look at the SciComm field analysis, where we have analyzed a couple of thousand research papers and, for example, seen that certain disciplines, in that case, the life sciences, the biological sciences, are disciplines where there's a lot of research on how those communicate, whereas there are other disciplines, mathematics, earth sciences, as far as I recall from the top of my head, where there's hardly any SciComm research on those sciences. So that could be already an interesting link to say, if you work in a field where you have the feeling that it hasn't been investigated as much as, for example, astronomy or synthetic biology, then this may already be a good link into like setting up a project and doing exactly that. The first point here on the left-hand side, trying to communicate to an uninterested or hostile audience. I think social inclusion has been something that also the research community has identified for a long time as a research gap. The fact that, let's say, the interest here is in how to address hostile audiences can also seem the other way around. Our analysis also, when then we included the expert panel, came to the conclusion that maybe we're focusing too much at hostile and contested scientific issues, and should actually also be looking at least just as much on the non-contested ones, let's say fundamental particle physics research, where if you're not in the film Illuminati, then people don't necessarily expect the end of the world. So it's that there's also science out there which is much less contested. So just as a reflection on those 2 points. On the right-hand side, what came up quite a lot was colleagues mentioning training. We interpreted that as, if there is a body of evidence informing practice, potentially informing practice even more than it does at the moment, how is that transfer going to be facilitated? Can we ensure that there will be in-house trainings? Can we organize workshops? Will there be MOOCs and things like that? So that's all encompassed under training, whether that should be as a standard be done in PhD programs. There has also been the argumentation that even on a postgraduate level, on a master's level, nobody should leave a university with a master's degree who hasn't done a module, let's say, on science and culture, on ethical, legal, social implications of science and things like that. So this is indeed a very hot topic, discussed also by the university community. The assumption that there's a gap between this increasing demand for what you can call it co-creation or stakeholder engagement. In the EU context, in Horizon Europe, we've been calling it a lot responsible research and innovation, RRI. So you have that on the one side, and on the other side, the unwillingness of academic institutions to provide training for that. So if you are a public engagement officer, then you may have worked traditionally with certain event formats, and maybe the press releases go out on a regular basis. But how do you actually take an evidence-based approach towards engaging stakeholders? And that has a lot to do, obviously, with social psychology, for example, but also innovation management and technology transfer and so on. So these questions could be addressed through in-house training, which, as we've also seen in previous studies, actually, that there's very little that the universities offer in that respect. There's quite a lot, let's say, in terms of camera training and interview training and training senior scientists in that. But this here goes, of course, far beyond the pure promotion, dissemination of results, but it's a more upstream inclusion of stakeholders in the research process. So apart from those 2 clusters, a bit more quickly, the other 2, let's maybe start on the left-hand side, that there's this interface between research and practice. We've we've decided to call this a continuum in the title for a reason, because it's probably unlikely that there will be two camps of people being either practitioners or scholars in the field, but many are also kind of mixing and merging, that there are practitioners who decide at some point to do a PhD in the field. There are practitioners who participate in a study or who actually dive very deeply in evaluation methods, which is a very applied form of science communication research, obviously. So this is mixing and probably quite interesting and exciting to see that this is happening. That's why if you see this more as a continuum, then how do we move right and left, so to speak, on that continuum between those two extremes? How that differs from other forms of communication research, a lot to say about that. One interesting recommendation could be the Open Science Agenda that was published by Tobias Dienlen and colleagues. I think it was also 2020 or a bit earlier, which addresses exactly this issue of communication science at large, of which you could argue science communication research is part of, so that communication science at large is comparatively closed and that there's a very comparatively low degree of replicability and replication. So that would be maybe something to look into. How to bridge the gap is exactly, of course, why we're meeting today, I suppose. And we have brought a couple of ideas, but much more interested, obviously, to hear what you're thinking. And the bubble here on the right-hand side, in terms of impact and evaluation, how to achieve impact in general, is possibly a bit of a statement too general to comment much on, but it is something that keeps coming up, that whatever you do, you at least want to specify in a methodologically robust way what has worked and what not and why, so that you can potentially also make the investment of time and effort more resource efficient, so to speak. Evaluation techniques, particularly for informal settings. If we stay with that bubble just for a second, it might be helpful to distinguish 4 different kinds of transfer here. If you consider it more up or downstream, then the downstream side would be evaluation. Using evidence to inform our understanding of what worked and what didn't once it's done. A similarly downstream understanding in research would be regarding the visibility and the discussion of an application of their results. So they've produced a theoretical framework and then now they're looking for someone to apply it. Both of those are very far downstream, and what we're wondering is whether there's a bigger potential to move that more upstream, the knowledge and the communication process. In terms of research, that would be to actually co-design and determine the research agenda. That's kind of what we're trying to do today as well. So if there are practice-relevant research questions, then why don't we address those increasingly, instead of a scientific community assuming somehow, imagine that this could be an interesting research question, instead of asking the communities what actually matters the most. Similarly with practice, a more upstream element would be not just to be interested in how effective it is what it is that I'm doing, but how can the theory of science communication inform a more strategic thinking. We could speak here of a theory of change, for example. How can I systematically assess the opportunities and options as to what's the most effective approach to achieving a certain change goal? I want to change an attitude or increase knowledge or change opinions or behaviors even, let's say health behaviors. Then what is the most effective way to do that? And that would be where research and theory would inform the practice very far upstream when the activities were still in planning. So we thought that this could be an interesting and relevant distinction to make. And leaving you at the moment with a marker for another paper that we produced last year, the Manifesto on Evidence-Based Science Communication, published in Frontiers. Part of that was a so-called knowledge cascade, because you've been asking here about how to bridge that gap. And you see that cascade on the right-hand side. I'm quickly zooming in. It basically goes here through those 4 different stages. The first challenge to determine whether and which evidence is relevant. And you can see that there are challenges to do that on the researcher side and on the practice side. once you acknowledge what is relevant or what is relevant evidence, then making that evidence accessible. That was the question we just had about access to peer-reviewed papers. But accessibility is, of course, more than just being able to download the 27-page PDF, but also being able to distill out of that what matters to you. So making the relevant evidence accessible once it's acknowledged. A third level would be once we have accessed this knowledge, then how do we enhance the transferability of accessible evidence? So yes, we can access it, and yes, we have agreed that it's relevant, potentially relevant from our work, but how can we transfer it directly into my practice and vice versa? And once we have transferred it, how do we rely that how do we make sure we only rely on quality assured knowledge? Not all the research out there is equally generalizable. There are entirely different degrees of quality, and some things are just case studies, let's say, on a certain particular activities somewhere in Southeast Asia or in Latin America, which is fascinating for those areas and those formats, but that is not necessarily transferable to a Swedish context and potentially even to a different format. So that is something that also would need to be investigated more systematically. Some of those were already clustered, as you have seen them in the 4 bubbles we've just gone through. There are a couple of others here. I suppose we're coming back to those in our discussion anyway. We have asked about then some socio-demographic variables, but I'm going to cut a few corners here now because otherwise it would take too long. Like we asked whether you have undertaken formal training. As you can see, half of those who responded have said yes. And from those who said yes, 3 did a university degree in SciComm and 6 did a short course. That would mean that 16 out of 19 respondents have not done any formal training in SciComm on university level, which is also something typical for the field. I'm not saying that in any critical way, just the numbers as they are here, that this is a very typical pattern. And this is also something that might explain some of the research needs and the needs also for transfer in this field. It took me a bit longer to summarize that, but it was really, really, really interesting for us to see even that on a small sample size like that, see the results. There's one chat message coming in from Michaela from SIDA's Unit for Research Cooperation, Sweden.
Oh, hi, Alexander and everyone. It was interesting. I filled in this survey, although I realized I did it too late for you to include my answers in your presentation now. But it made me realize that as a science communicator and formerly a science journalist, you have to learn from doing, and you learn from colleagues, and you learn from watching others, and very, very rarely from reading any science, any research papers in science communication. And it struck me during your presentation why this is so. I think many people working in science communication do so because we love science, but we're also very interested in storytelling. And we want, we're interested in how to efficiently tell a story. And that means that well-written blog posts or well-produced podcasts will be very much more interesting to us than a scientific paper. It has to be a really well-written scientific paper, really on spot on what we're interested in for us, or at least for me to read it. I don't know if others shared this experience. And I can recognize this even in your presentation. I'm so interested in these issues that I almost fell asleep.
It is a fact that many in the field have a journalistic background and less so in institutional communication. And I think that might be, like me as well, actually. And I think that is often, let's say, an artistic motivation in producing something that reads well, or as you say, tells a nice story. Storytelling, however, is of course more than the beauty of a nicely readable text, but it's actually quite a sophisticated set of methodologies and tools and skills. For example, we have a storytelling module which runs an entire semester, so probably something like 60 or 80 hours of lectures just on the techniques of storytelling. So there is the artistic approach to just produce a text that is nice to read, and there is the evidence we have from, let's say, cognition science, from psychology, from linguistics. Obviously, I should have probably mentioned that first, as to how texts work, which analogies work, in which way and why, how framing works, how priming works. All of these are things that the body of evidence would probably provide. Let's see who else wants to comment. Yeah, I think before we go to the Q&A, there was Marina Joubert who left a comment. In the same way that we encourage scientists and other disciplines to tell good stories and make their SciComm researchers should also be engaging. Yeah, so that's our job, of course. So there is, as a need for science communication, of research on science communication. Who might be next? I would like to raise a question, please. Is there anyone, first of all, who would like to respond to Michaela Landell first, so that we maybe address that point?
You know, that I also battle to stay up to date with research. I think all researchers have that challenge, you know, to stay up to date with all the papers published that could be relevant to you. So I imagine for practitioners, you know, it is even more difficult. So I just think that as science communication researchers, maybe we shouldn't expect practitioners and indeed other researchers to necessarily always discover the actual research in the journals themselves, but we should make an effort, you know, via social media, via popular summaries, via platforms like The Conversation and any other normal communication means to make our research more discoverable, specifically for people that it's relevant to. Because I take Michaela's point, you know, unless it's really, really directly relevant to a practitioner, they're not going to engage with it. And I think it's part of our responsibility, but it's very hard to do, of course. But, you know, it's part of our responsibility to take the research beyond the journals and to digest it and to summarize it and to make visual summaries and to tweet it and all those things so that practitioners can then filter and distill and actually only go and read the articles that are truly directly relevant to them once they've been able to read our summaries and our sort of digests of that research. I basically think it's too much to expect that, you know, that everybody should go to the journals and stay up to date.
Thank you very much, Marina. Discoverability is a very important point, particularly since we're not talking about dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of papers out there on SciComm research, but it is a number that is in 5 digits or probably even 6 digits. So nobody in the world will ever be able to read all of that. And even if you focus just on, let's say, museology in life sciences, you would probably come up with several hundred of relevant publications. So we will need transfer mechanisms that are much more effective than what we see at the moment. Whatever they will look like is a different point. Somebody else was, it's Anna-Marie Pendrill in the chat, was saying something along these lines. Is there research on the effectiveness of the practices of communication of research on science communication? So the communication of science communication research, that is, I think, what I also just mentioned. That is what this project is trying to explore indeed, but more than just to understand the potential deficits in that transfer, but also to actually actively establish transfer mechanisms that pose a solution. Anna Faustino, you should have the open mic now.
Hello, everyone. I come from Portugal, but I'm actually now in Germany. Hello. So my question is about one of the challenges that you showed in the results about the lack of co-creation and stakeholder engagement. And I was actually wondering, because over the past years, I worked a lot with co-creation and participation processes, but more applied to science education. So together with teachers and schools on how to create science education tools and approaches that are more effective when teaching science to students. And my question is, because I was wondering how, if you could give 1 or 2 examples on how to apply this co-creation and stakeholder engagement processes to science communication. So for example, if you would have the goal of promoting more science engagement initiatives in a science institution, how would you make it possible using this co-creation and stakeholder engagement processes? Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Very important follow-up point on one of the findings here. Yeah. And it doesn't always have to be me, far from the fact that I'm not the burning bush anyway who has all the answers, far from that, but it should be a discussion among everyone, which is of course a bit difficult to facilitate virtually, I can see. So if you have something to say about what Anna just asked. In general, I mentioned RRI earlier, Anna, the responsible research and innovation, which might be closest to what is it you're saying, because that is a lot also about institutional change, how you convince also people and colleagues internally, the executives in the university, the professors in the university, the postdocs, down to the students basically. How do you convince them of the added value of reaching out to stakeholders, also not just downstream, but also quite far upstream. So early on when it comes to determining research topics and so on. So I think that the whole field of RRI, responsible research and innovation research, could be quite informative. That is, however, quite a lot of work. There have probably been about, let's say, 50 projects, core projects in the last, let's say, decade investigating that. So trying to summarize that in 30 seconds is definitely impossible. But it is, for us today, I think it would already be very satisfactory to capture those key questions and to say, okay, how can we basically facilitate a process that allows to give answers to questions like these? I mean, we can't have workshops like that on a daily basis. We can't have them pro bono either, I suppose. Everybody needs to get paid somehow. But what could be transfer mechanisms for Anna Faustino's question to find an evidence-based answer, to say, okay, give us 2 weeks and you get a compendium of 20 pages giving you the best available evidence on that question. That's kind of on a meta level, the issue that we wanted to address today. Let me look in my list again. I have a raised hand from John C.
Fantastic. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Fantastic. So I wanted to draw a distinction between science communicators and scientists who communicate, because I've done a lot of varied science communication. For example, in writing books, I've had to speak to scientists and take, say, their frontier knowledge or research and try and communicate it into layman terms. But then also working in a public event, for example, workshops or doing shows, you're working with different ages. And I don't consider myself as a scientist who communicates. Although I have a background in engineering, I consider my main role on a daily basis as an actual science communicator, as in I'm trying to take what other people are doing and convey it to the public. So I think having that distinction will affect the way we can answer some of the questions and even some of the things put in the survey, because my field is science communication. So whether there's a lot of data in my field, that would be looking into science communication rather than looking in the communication of astronomy or the communication of biotechnology, for example. So I just wanted to see how you distinguish it yourself, and I'm interested in how the panel and attendees regard themselves. Are they science communicators or scientists who communicate science?
Any responses in the chat, maybe? Yeah, Marlene, for example, saying, consider myself to be a bit of both. But it is indeed a continuum which is being discussed a lot. Not necessarily every chemist or physicist who from time to time engages with lay audiences would need to be called a science communicator. This is someone whose job it is to be behind the lab bench and to teach and do research on a regular basis, and also sees like a mandate of, let's say, once a month or 2 days a month to engage with public audiences. So I think this is something that is the case for many, many tens of thousands of researchers in the world. There is research, actually quite a lot, also on why scientists do that and why they don't, and what the motivations are. I mentioned earlier that I picked a fight this morning with Neil deGrasse Tyson and Brian Cox in the same tweet, because both, I think, are some of those celebrity scientists who think that pumping up the volume of trying to educate the public as to this is what the science says, and if we were all to comply with that, then the pandemic would go away miraculously, is, if I may paint it a bit black and white here, is only a very tiny part of the story. So I think at that border crossing between publicly communicating researchers and a science communicator in practice, like full-time employed, professional in the field, is that the latter would probably be more reflexive as to why they do it, how they do it, probably a wider spectrum of objectives and tools to use. But that's just, of course, my personal take on it. There are a couple of, I think, responses to your point, John, also in the chat. There's Sana. I think it's important to identify yourself somehow if the roles are mixed. Are you now talking as a scientist or as a journalist communicator, or which is your role now? I think it's a rhetorical question, I suppose, not directed at me or anyone. Michaela from earlier, again in the chat, if you're a good communicator, it's more a matter of spirit and personality than title. Interesting point, yeah. Very interesting. There are scientists that I consider to be great science communicators. They don't need any assistance by professional science communicators. That probably means, again, capability of storytelling, being able to enthuse an audience so that the spark basically, that they can connect. A point here that I may want to make, since we're talking about the practice research gap disconnect or transfer, is how do you know what makes someone, you said here, a good communicator, or let's say a successful communicator. How do you actually determine success? And there we have our own hunches and our own impressions saying, oh, that event felt good, or I had the feeling that that guy or that lady came across very well to a certain audience. But unless we do proper and methodologically robust impact evaluation, which is also, let's say, from a scientific point of view, neutral and objective, we'll never know. And since we've done a lot of evaluation studies in the past for all kinds of institutions around the world, you very often have the case that you go into a botanical garden or a zoo or a university or a science museum, and the curators or the people who run the show are utterly convinced that what they've been doing for the last 10 years is the best possible way, and that this has been so successful. But it turns out that it's actually one of the least successful activities that they've ever started, and that other things that they had totally neglected because they're out of a certain filter bubble are suddenly the activities which are either much more impactful and address or answer more to the objectives and the goals of the institution, or are just much more cost efficient, that actually the institution managed to reach the same effect with hundreds of the resources being invested, and something like that only emerges if you do proper evaluation. That might be a point to take into account when assuming that if we have the feeling that somebody is a good communicator, and not using good as a normative term, but as a successful and impactful communicator, that we only know that really once we analyze it scientifically. Would be, again, my personal point of view, obviously, here. Okay, there are two new messages. We should probably, a raised hand, I hear, a raised hand, let's see. Raised hand. There's a raised hand by Eva Garmendia. So, Eva, if I may give you the mic first.
Yes, can you hear me well?
Very well, thank you.
Yes, Eva Garmendia here from Uppsala University in Sweden. My comment is regarding to what John was commenting, and I think the issue here, or the conversation between science communicators or scientists that communicate, and that they might feel the responsibility to communicate, it comes a little bit from the misalignment between like you as a scientist and getting paid by taxpayer money. Part of your work should be also to go back to society and bring your science and communicate your science. And then the lack of really support by the university for someone else that is a science communicator to do this. So it kind of falls into the researcher to do all these tasks. Whereas I think if we will have a stronger networks or stronger places where researchers could go and resource science communicators to do this job, maybe we could clear up the question about this. I think like at least here is very uncommon that there is good support for the scientists to perform the communication activities that are supposed to be required every time they apply for a grant, that they are supposed to have a section of how are you going to communicate this, but then there is a gap between how do they do that. Do they do it themselves, or do a science communicator does it? And I think there's not so much support for these scientists.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. From Uppsala, I believe it was, Eva. I think it's support in terms of, we had training beforehand, hence what kind of actual skills trainings are provided, but that could also include more reflective exercises. So are there any committees or bodies in the university which are open for everyone to engage on? How should our institution, for example, be engaging with the different stakeholder groups, and how not? But it's not necessarily just even training, but probably also recognition. So is this something that actually is valuable enough for your career progression? We've been discussing a lot about the Sagan effect, for example, where Carl Sagan, one of the early high-profile science communicators, was apparently had disadvantages to experience because he invested so much time and effort into communicating publicly. But actually, that Sagan effect could never be shown as clearly empirically as one may think. And times have probably also changed, but that doesn't change the fact that there is still, we call those systemic factors, that the system of science, the system of academia doesn't necessarily systematically incentivize outreach activities in general, at least not on all career levels. And then, let's say, certain tenured elderly colleagues, like myself maybe, have the time to do these things, have the time to just prepare and run a workshop because they feel like it, or set up a MOOC, which if you're in an early postdoctoral phase of your life, you have maybe other things to worry about, how to get tenure. Yeah? So all of these factors are systemic, and they call for rethinking the recognition mechanisms and the career mechanisms. So it is a big picture, I suppose. Right, so you've probably in the meantime already had a couple of other comments in the chat. I can't follow all of them at the moment at the same time. Let me maybe quickly mention the two questions in the Q&A. So the colleagues who have dropped some messages in, and then we should probably first of all proceed, if that's okay with you, with the agenda. Otherwise, we're running out of time. There is Tahir Batul, if I pronounce that correctly, forgive me if not, asking how are you planning to give education about science communication? Are short courses not enough? Again, a question that probably can't easily be answered with yes or no. I've been teaching and training in SciComm for about a decade now, and I've accredited courses around the world and helped set up such courses. We're actually building a master's degree, a new master's degree as we speak. The question comes up every time, can we expect anyone actually to dedicate 1.5 years of their life full-time to do that? Well, certainly not the people that John was referring to, because they do it as a side issue. They want to be as professional and successful as possible, obviously. But if you are, let's say, a postdoc in SynBio, you can't just bugger off for 3 semesters and do a master's in SciComm, I suppose. That's not normally what would happen. So how can we find shorter training seminars that address that. There has been recently a book published by Todd Newman, my colleague at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the US. Some of the chapters in there are actually quite interesting, and one of the earlier ones, I think it's the third by John Basley and colleagues, investigated very interestingly what those short courses offered for scientists to communicate publicly actually offer and what they don't. They are very, very much predominantly skills oriented. So it is about public speaking, it's about writing, it's about storytelling. What is missing, what they're explaining very well there is an awareness and a reflexivity about science as an element in culture, science as a part of culture, science as a part of societal and policy-making processes. I briefly mentioned the pandemic earlier as an example, which also is a key topic, obviously, for the Science Communication Conference that's starting tomorrow. I was tempted to say in Gothenburg, but just virtually, is that the pandemic has shown us that the scientific evidence and people understanding how certain virological processes work out is one element, but possibly not even the major point that makes people buy into or reject the mitigation policies that come with it. If they want to wear a mask or not, if they want to comply with the lockdown measures or not, it's not a question whether they understand how herd immunity works or what an RMNR vaccine works like, but it is much more about reflecting on the ethical and the legal and the social implications of that work and how that changes the way people live and how you basically balance those different trade-offs. These contents are hardly present at all in the shorter trainings that are offered to scientists. And you could argue that then you get an army of walking, talking biologists and walking, talking physicists who are very good at explaining their science, however, believing that explaining it and like telling the world about it makes a significant difference, which is empirically what is unfortunately has been shown empirically is not necessarily the case. But that's a wide field, I suppose, so we can't get into it too deeply here. There was one more question in the Q&A by Lynn Dibdahl. Thank you for the presentation of the survey. Could you tell us more about the pathways to praxis? Which probably means the project. That is something that that's literally starting as we speak. So the survey that we've basically tested, beta tested now with you guys, is going to be public soon, and then we're trying to capture data from the worldwide practitioners community to understand that better. But as I said earlier, it's not just about understanding where those disconnects between the evidence and the practice and the different kinds of practice are, and whether these are downstream or upstream, as explained earlier. But we actually want to establish actual transfer mechanisms, online platforms and so on, that will facilitate that transfer. Okay, so in the interest of time, I can see that there were loads of messages in the chat, which is great. I'm going to save that, by the way, and we're going to check that more in peace and with more peace and quiet afterwards. So maybe we can also follow up with a couple of questions. There is also a LinkedIn event page, by the way, to this workshop where we could start a conversation on individual comments like that after the event. We went through the results of the survey. We had a bit of a longer discussion now about the implications of that and much far beyond, which was super exciting for me. I hope you enjoyed that as much as it's possible in that disconnected virtual environment, which we unfortunately are. We wanted to share a couple of findings from the field analysis now, which basically provides an empirical underpinning as to what the research field out there really looks like. The plan was then to have a discussion on that, either in breakout groups or here in the forum again. Here we go. So just very briefly, what have we done methodologically? There has been a lot of discourse about what the community has apparently been researching and what not. The interesting thing for me was that we really managed to find the resources to do a full bibliometric analysis, content analysis of more than 3,000 journal papers, and also a significant amount of gray literature. So we actually went through every single paper intellectually, with particularly those research support staff that you see on the right-hand side and obviously people above, to analyze exactly what are the, and these are the key journals here, what are the basic scientometric data, like, of course, as mentioned earlier, how many papers were published, let's say, from Swedish or by Swedish authors, for example. But these questions were much less relevant for us than understanding which methodologies were applied, in which context were these studies undertaken, how many of those were empirical studies and how many are actually commentaries, what topics were they dealing with, which disciplines, how were different groups of participants engaged, what was the target group, and so on, what were these one-off studies or on the longitudinal design. So we really wanted to understand how and what those studies were about. It has been mentioned before that there is a small-scale study on the, I think it was the 3 core journals, which you can also see here at the top of that graph down there, Public Understanding of Science, Science Communication, and SciComm, as to how many Swedish authors are in those journals. We have looked at a couple of other journals, as you can see here, but that is even only the tip of the iceberg, even though those were about 3,000 papers that we analyzed, and we then also added everything we could find on science communication in journals such as Nature, Science, Scientific American, to have a bit more of a diverse set. But actually, this is a long-term pattern. Rick Borkelt has conducted a study a couple of years ago, which he then stopped because he could see that with normal research methods, he would not be able to even get close to analyzing that big data, because he identified with the Google Scholar search almost 500 journals in which science communication research has been published. And again, that is probably not all of them, but we are definitely speaking not about 3, not about 20, but several hundred academic journals in which science communication research is published on a more or less regular basis. So we have a big data pattern. We have furthermore gray literature, where we have not just hundreds, but tens of thousands of project reports and conference proceedings, books and blog posts, all of which would actually need to be incorporated in analysis like that. That is what the follow-up project of this field analysis has already been looking into for the last few weeks or months, even in the meantime, is a machine learning approach, with automating basically the analysis, and we're using the quite robust, in terms of intercoder reliability, quite robust analysis of the intellectually coded material as training data to calibrate the machine learning approach. So without that, again, that would be something that would be really difficult to do, but thanks to the existing analysis, we can use that, so to speak, as training data. The analysis, and again, these are probably too many details, but important for us is that we actually achieved really good intercoder reliability values, but I suppose I just skip the most of the methodological section for now. You can read and look at that in detail afterwards. We're sharing all the links with the presentations, obviously, afterwards. We didn't just want to analyze the content of existing research, but we also wanted the research community to reflect on those results. So we added a panel study with 18 of what I would say the world's most renowned experts in the field, some of them at least. And we went through several phases of interviews. At the time, was conducted by my Australian colleague, Jenny Metcalf, who then discussed the core findings from the bibliometric analysis with them, and we tried to draw conclusions as to what that means, and so on. So we identified, or they, basically the expert panel, we just wrote up the results, identified those 10 challenges here. And again, in the interest of time, I have no intention to go through all of them, obviously. Feel free to look at the study if you want to have an even deeper understanding as to what the research body looks like that's out there. To maybe pick out just as an example, one of the key challenges was that only 3% of the papers analyzed were what we call longitudinal. They were on a longer time scale. Most of these studies were one-off studies. That means you don't really, for example, track the educational journey of a teenager through his 20s, through his early first employments as a young scientist, for example, into adolescence and so on. So this is something that is done very, very, very rarely. We see a lot of case studies. So it was something that also matches very much what the National Academy of Sciences in the US has identified as the key challenge in science communication research, is that we need more comparative, more longitudinal, more systematic or systems research to understand how those different contents with those different channels, with those different actors and audiences interrelate. So instead of looking at those things individually, to look at them together. We had, again, probably skipping some of these things here because we want to have time left for discussion. The authorship of SciComm research has certainly diversified a lot in the last couple of years. Europe is now by far leading the pack, whereas it used to be the US. There is a disciplinary focus in many research studies on SciComm. I've mentioned that before in terms of life sciences. You can see it here with biology and environment. So if a SciComm research study has focused on a discipline or on a field, it was mostly life sciences, to some extent technosciences, but then you can already see all the other disciplines are only covered very, very rarely. Maths and earth sciences and so on. Actually, quite a few people tweeting how frustrating that is, that nobody's interested in how the earth sciences communicated. That was quite sad to see. Down there at the bottom, by the way, when it says no discipline, also, of course, includes all of those studies which are about SciComm in general. I see a few chat messages coming in. I suggest I'm not looking at them right now because it would be a bit challenging to finish the Prezi and respond to that immediately. I'm almost finished anyway there. In addition to the challenges that were identified, there were main research gaps. Again, only a few of which I want to mention. That information behavior is changing, that these digitized media environments just change the way we used to think about, let's say, needing journalism or needing print media or legacy media to reach wider audiences, which leads to filter bubbles and echo chambers and all of these things. The rapidly changing media systems, as already said just now, evaluation of policy impacts, so not just necessarily how many people visit an event, or so also the longer term outcomes in a form of behavioral change, and also impact on regulation, on science policy, on technology policy and innovation policy, something that is hardly being researched at the moment at all. Communication governance is something that is increasingly demanded also by research funding organizations, being back again also with responsible research and innovation, RRI. So how does that affect the institutional structures and incentives and career mechanisms in science? Something that also, according to the expert panel, we would need much more research on, because we, looking at the evidence, didn't really find it much in the existing body of research. We gave a couple of recommendations, as you can see here, many of which might actually already have been mentioned in the last hour, which, so I don't have to go through them maybe in detail either at the moment, but one of the recommendations that may be worth pointing out here is that at the moment, the community is still working quite a lot in traditional methodology. So it is mainly about conducting surveys, speaking of which, we've just done one, and looking at certain texts like newspaper databases or analyzing TV broadcasts. If that doesn't, if that's not how it's done, then there are more or less structured and standardized interviews being used. And already when it comes to observational techniques, which have, as you can see, has increased significantly the use of them, but participatory observation, which is very common in psychology, is still only done in less than every fifth study in SciComm. There is a very wide spectrum of other techniques and methods that could be applied. Big data analysis be just one, where the experts were wondering whether we are exploiting the toolbox enough, and whether that might be something that could also, in the discourse between practitioners and researchers, be something that could be enriched. So again, don't want to keep you too long with that presentation. Just basically as a cliffhanger, the whole thing is freely open access, so doesn't cost anything to look at it. I hope it's been written up in a way where you don't fall asleep by going through it. Has an executive summary, so don't hesitate to look at the material directly. So then we, I suppose, can maybe continue just the conversation from earlier. If I would be allowed to encourage something, I would say maybe more on a more meta and abstract level as to how we can together proceed to fix this and how we can improve the situation, instead of trying to identify individual answers to specific questions, which I probably can't give from the top of my head anyway. Marina is mentioned by Michaela Landell. I think Marina hit an important point. Researchers in science communication need to popularize and condense their messages to practitioners. One message above. Okay. How do we evaluate normally science communication, like in the example with the botanical garden? Yeah. Let me maybe start by sharing a few ideas. So evaluation is not just measuring what is often mistaken, the outputs and the outcomes. It's not just measuring how many clicks you have, or how many participants join an exhibition, or how many downloads there are. But from what I mentioned earlier, theory of change perspective, we're really interested in the original objective. The term value is in the term evaluation for no reason, for a reason. Sorry for that slip of tongue. Because we want to revisit the original idea. Why did we do this activity after all? What was the original intention? What was the objective? What did we want to change? Did we want to change people's attitudes or opinion, or even maybe health behavior, for example, is always an example that's often taken. And if that is clearly specified, then you can define performance indicators, key performance and impact indicators, where you can say, so we can say that this behavior or this attitude has changed by measuring how it was before and how it was afterwards. And then you would actually define success criteria, or also quantify those success criteria before you actually start doing something, before having that science cafe, or before having that science slam, or putting out that new magazine, or what have you. And so that is important to understand, that as much as impact evaluation is often done at the end of an activity, it requires thinking about the design of the evaluation at the beginning of the activity, because otherwise you can't connect the objectives with the tactics and the activities in the end. That's a fundamental principle, I suppose, which is often not necessarily taken into account. That also means that evaluation involves a lot of reflexivity and, let's say, forces you to think about whether there would have been different ways to do things, more efficient and more effective ways to do things possibly. And that might mean that you shouldn't do it on your own, but that you should have an external partner or external partners in a consortium to bounce ideas off and to monitor and evaluate one another. There's a message coming in. Maybe we need science communicator role models to demonstrate how to apply an outcome from the SciComm research. Yeah. There is a funding scheme in the US, I think it's the National Science Foundation, where you have to have a scholar and the practitioner who apply together for a research grant. I think it's the only program I know of its kind in the world. The German Volkswagen Foundation has set up something similar recently, but it's more about funding entire institutions and not projects. So the fact that that is something that we basically don't see is, I think, illustrates very well that how can we arrive at role models, or maybe call them best practices. Yeah? How can we show the added value of doing that if we don't incentivize and fund it? But John, please feel free to share with us via audio and/or video.
So obviously there are many different types of communicators. So I've worked with a lot that have done television, have done shows, and I would call them almost the visible science communicators. I also know quite a few journalists, but I don't see them as visible, as it were. They're visible for people who follow their blogs or who read the newspapers, but they're not kind of out in front of the public saying, hey guys, this is science, look over here, this is what we're bringing to you. And I think a lot of science communicators might have the problem of when we present them with research, they may feel that it limits their freedom to almost perform or to do what they're doing. They're used to quite a lot of freedom, and every time when I've done science communication, I've always sat and wondered, how is this affecting the public? What could I have done better? How could I have improved what I'm doing? What research is there to inform me of this? But then I think they need to feel that they have the flexibility to see that research, but not necessarily have to follow it. And I think they may feel that as science communicating researchers, we may be saying, this is what you should be doing, when actually it's not. It's just saying, look, here are some things we've seen. Why don't you give it a go? And so I think in that type of thinking, having role models, science communicators who say, look, I've seen this research and it made 3 or 4 recommendations. I've taken this recommendation and I've used it in this way, and this is the difference I've noticed. Although that in itself might require somebody to be sat in the audience and researching specifically what difference it has made. But I think it has been mentioned before that a lot of the research that is done isn't really research, it's just anecdotal evidence based on the audience looked happy, I got some good claps, they walked away smiling, they shook my hand and said thank you, so it was a success. And so I think, again, it's like you just said, is how do we measure that success? But I do believe that having role models there to show how the outcomes of the research can be applied would go quite a long way into giving some other science communicators confidence in following some of the advice.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I mean, in order to demonstrate it, it has to be done in the first place, obviously. And I think we're really talking also about something that is the exception. I very much like this assumption that, or this hypothesis that there might be, people might be feeling this as a constraint to their creativity, if you put it like that. Yeah. And again, I mean, I've been in practice myself for quite a long time, about 10 years each in journalism and in PR. And I had my hobby horses, and I've told that story publicly before, so it's not too much of a coming out here. But I had my hobby horses, which I loved, like my own little magazine, and it was at some point the best-selling popular science magazine in the country. But you don't really want to know what works and what doesn't, and whether you reach those target audiences that we were supposed to reach, and whether the costs that went into it at some point with a quite large editorial staff and a graphic designer and art director and what have you, that all those efforts are proportionate or disproportionate to the effects and the change you actually achieve. So I never really asked the question at the time because I didn't want to hear the answer, because the answer could have been, yeah, it's okay, but actually other things you do are just as impactful, but you invest only 1/10 of the money into it. How would I have had sold that internally then? You know? So I think it's also people taking care of their babies, which is nice because it shows how much enthusiasm is in much of the communication we see out there. But if we're honest, how frustrated we are with much of the communication about the global pandemic, for example, at the moment, how frustrated we are with the lack of sustainable success in climate change, mitigation and adaptation policies being communicated in a way where we see the change much faster, maybe. So that frustration should, I think, also enthuse more willingness to self-reflexivity, yeah, to say, so if I want to be more effective, if I want these things to change faster, then I have to also sit down and say, am I doing everything perfectly in an ideal way? Yeah. So I think that reflexivity, when I spoke earlier about the upstream application of theory, and is very different from the evaluation of things we're doing anyway. And if those things could come together, you could be, as a practitioner, basically bracketed or framed in a way where you have the support both in the ideation and conceptualization phase and in understanding what you're actually doing. So maybe we're not thinking about that not enough on a time scale also. So let's see who else. Oh yeah, there are quite a few messages in the meantime. Kelly Blumenthal, perhaps science communicators for the science communication research. Yeah, that has been mentioned before. I mean, you would basically then also need to apply research to the science communication or science communication research if you want to do it effectively, which might be an additional challenge, and we're not on the meta level. But that is very much, I think, where one of the challenges lies. It's not about just making all of that available or accessible or putting it out there. As Marina said, there are thousands of papers each year which nobody in the world can read. They are often written in a way where, like really 25 pages. Do I really have the time to read through that? And if you've made the bad experience of having 3 papers which then didn't really resonate with what it is that you've done, then maybe you hesitate doing that another time. So what could the transfer mechanisms for, as Kelly called it here, the SciComm of SciComm research, what could those be? If you have concrete ideas, please don't hesitate to let us know, because we are building such also journalistic mechanisms as we speak. It shouldn't just be a newsletter. It shouldn't just be, let's say, the study of the day or the study of the week. But we probably would also need to think about something that, for example, we refer to as systematic reviews in the EBSC, in the Evidence-Based Science Communication Manifesto last year, where a methodologically trained expert on a certain topic area would need to sit down and say, I'm screening, let's say, the 150 or 250 studies out there on a certain topic, and I'm assessing them for their methodological validity or the generalizability and so on. And then I'm saying, okay, those 100 studies are nice, but they're actually not robust enough to draw any general conclusions from. And then there are those 35 studies here, and then we can draw on a meta level certain. That's what medical research has been doing. Evidence-based medicine has been doing for a long time with great success. And something like that is basically not happening at all in SciComm, or as it has been mentioned earlier, in communication science in general. That has to do with the lack of transparency regarding open data, open methodology, with the fact that hardly any of the work is being replicated. So these are studies that are done at one time somewhere, let's say in Colombia, and then there unfortunately is no one in Russia saying, hey, I'm going to do and try this in St. Petersburg as well. Yeah. That is the case in most other fields of science. That's something that our discipline so far hasn't been really doing. So let me keep scrolling here. Where were we? We were here. Michaela. Doing evaluation properly, like measuring change in attitudes, can often take more time and effort than the communication activities themselves. It can be hard to combine when, as for many science communicators, time is scarce. What advice can you give to find a feasible level of evaluation? Yeah. But one of the key statements of that colleague, I think it was 2016, was that it should be considered unethical not to evaluate your communication. Because A, you don't know whether what it is that you do is effective. B, you don't know whether any other approach would have been more effective, speaking of using taxpayers' money, for example. So maybe you've just wasted 50,000 euros because you've chosen the wrong path. And C, if you don't evaluate, you can't even guarantee that your activity wasn't even counterproductive. And external independent evaluation has shown actually over and over again that often you have the exact opposite result of what people originally intended to do. So not evaluating shouldn't actually be an option anymore. Then, of course, leveling that out is always a challenge. You can find methodologically all kinds of ways of doing that in a form, for example, highly standardized, using professional partners who do this all the time, who can set an impact evaluation up within an afternoon, whereas you would maybe otherwise need to define and then test and calibrate measurement instruments for weeks. So maybe building on other people's experience and expertise might be a recommendation. Working maybe with closed-ended, more quantitative approaches than, for example, doing focus groups, which then have to be transcribed and reverse translated and coded and so on. So these things can consume enormous amounts of time, whereas sometimes a quantitative survey with closed-ended questions does the job, yeah, particularly if you have little resources. And again, if that is highly standardized, something like that can be set up in a couple of hours. It can be conducted in a couple of days, and you have the results literally on your fingertips. Like the results from this survey we looked into this morning because we wanted to let it run until the last minute. And at least from a descriptive statistical point of view, you have the results literally in the same second. When it comes to inferential analysis, of course, it's more complex. Lynn Dibdal, would you please point us in the direction of good and practically relevant research about the link between SciComm and societal impact of research? The link between SciComm and societal impact of research, yeah. We actually have an event next week about that, the final event of an EU project we've been running for the last 4 years, which is about RRI, which I know I've been mentioning maybe too many times, responsible research and innovation. That might be a recommendation to maybe just, I can follow up with a recording of that or with a few recommendations. Where do I start? Like maybe social innovation could be a good starting point. Social innovation, assuming that it's not necessarily just about the economic benefit or even the technological feasibility of a solution, but whether it contributes to the greater societal good and makes the world a better place. And if then somebody earns a lot of money with it, that's fine, but that's not the key objective. So maybe social innovation might be a starting point, but there are many. Let me maybe think about it. That could be a point where we could follow up with suggestions of what to read and what to recommend. Okay, Annette Klinkert is next. Being a practitioner myself, I sometimes feel that SciComm research follows a rather deficit-oriented approach while not understanding the complexity of engagement activities. A top-down approach telling them what to do because we know it's right may lead to defense mechanisms in the practitioners' community, but not to collaborations. Yeah, I mean, we've been engaging on this field analysis now for about a year. That is something that we expected and something that I was personally quite afraid of, and something we also explicitly said both in the EBSC paper and in the field analysis, that we wanted to avoid creating yet another deficit, that's saying there is this body of evidence and if you use that everything will be fine. Stupid, of course, it's never how it's going to work. Interestingly enough, that is a notion that I can't remember from any of the events we've had, and we've had probably half a dozen larger events now with several hundred people, ever to be foregrounded. Interesting enough, the opposition, if any, was larger from the scientific community by far. It's more that researchers want to keep doing what it is that they've done without bothering about what might be more important or more urgent or more necessary or more difficult to do, because they've always done these attitudes to science surveys and so on, and that's something that people like and consume. So we had the feeling that there's much more resistance against changes in the research being done than in practitioners feeling that their comfort zones might be invaded, if you want. Yeah, there's Anne-Marie Pendrell. I remember an early Excite conference when I was told that everything works for the first-hand developers. I suppose I prefer to leave this as a rhetorical question. Jenny Björkman, at our foundation, we are now trying to build an impact evaluation and communication public engagement projects, and have from start worked with the evaluation in one project to look into if we can learn something from this, and especially if it is possible to build a model for future programs. Yeah? So learning from your own experiences, I suppose. It is not finished yet, but we have learned a lot by doing this and by working together, researcher, artists, evaluators, and communicators. Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing the experience, Jenny. Just imagine if that were to work between organizations. In the medical sciences, for example, we in the meantime register trials. So if you conduct an experiment, particularly with human subjects, you register it first, and then the community knows that you are conducting that evaluation or that analysis, and you are also then forced to publish, not necessarily publicly, but to upload your results somewhere. So you can't just upload the positive evaluations, and the negative is what nobody will ever see and talk about. That, of course, requires, if we did the same thing for evaluations with registered reports for all evaluation work going on out there, that we would also see the potentially not so positive evaluation outcomes. Yeah.
Now I just got a question if there's a link to this project where we try to build in evaluation from the start, and there's not yet anyway, since this is all work in progress. But we hope that this evaluation process our hope is that this could be a model which researchers who seek funding from us and do want to communicate them or do want to join in public engagement can use, and that we can share with others. But it's still not there. But for example, we have learned a lot of what you have been discussing here, that it's very expensive and very time consuming to have evaluation processes. That is really, when you really want to measure what impact something has. In this case, it's a film, so it's very time consuming. But we also have learned that the researchers, when they started to think about impact evaluation from the start, they wanted to reach everyone and everything and the stars and the moons. And what we have learned is that the main thing that we will try to build in the model is to lower their expectations on what they actually can do, and on what they actually can, how far they can reach out, and what they actually can change when they do something. But this will have to be more modified when the model is finished and so on, which is not yet.
If I understand it correctly, Jenny, then you're probably from a research funding organization, a foundation.
Yes, I am.
Okay. Which is very interesting, because the research community has said that for a very long time, that the RFOs, the research funding organizations, be them state or private philanthropies, like more in the US, for example, that they have a very large lever in their hands. If they were to requiring certain forms of evaluation, then this would be an enormous progress. I mean, this is part of our job as academics. We review proposals all the time, be it on regional, national, or also European level. And the requirements are very, very low regarding the specification of how projects intend to measure the effect of what it is that they're doing in outreach.
Well, I can say that we actually, when we did have a tryout for communication projects for 3 years, and we actually asked the researchers and the communicators who applied for those communication projects to have an evaluation in the first application they sent in. And when they were finished, we could see that most of them didn't use their evaluation at all and didn't finish it. So this was where we started to work in a kind of different way in order to make people really use the evaluation when they start a project, and not to have it as a time consuming and money consuming thing at the end of the process.
Yeah.
But this has been, but we're not finished yet, and I will try to share this when it's finished.
It's great to hear that you are on that way. As I said, most of your colleagues are far from that, at least when it comes to really pinning down, quantifying and qualifying what has worked and what hasn't, because it would need to be a requirement that needs to be expressed not during the project, obviously, but during, actually before the proposals are handed in. And each proposal has to contain a paragraph that doesn't just vaguely explain, we intend to do outreach and we want to do this, but A, why do you want to do this and not any other outreach or communication formats? B, how do you intend to prove that that was a good use of your resources? And C, doing that methodologically in a way where you actually do measure the outcomes and not just document the outputs, which, for example, reviewing EU proposals is almost always the case that they say we have so and so many downloads and so many clicks and followers and friends. And well, you know, I can generate a couple of thousand friends on Facebook within 5 minutes. It just cost me $39 at the moment. I can create a shitstorm and you have more followers than you ever wanted to have. Yeah, but it doesn't mean anything, obviously, qualitatively as to the impact of your work. And as long as that is not ingrained in the research calls and also in the evaluation by the reviewers of those calls, looking specifically for certain criteria when it comes to how that's going to be measured, things are not going to change. Because one last sentence to that, I think academia follows the money more than many other industries do. So if the money were going in that direction, the academia would also say, oh, if that's the case, then we need to think carefully how we prove that in the future. Okay, wow, 23 new messages. Well, we're certainly not going to be able to go through all of them in time because the time is technically up. You have already seen probably there are quite a few really interesting recommendations of activities in Sweden. Marina was saying that there's something to think about. Does every SciComm project need to be evaluated, or can we design effective project informed by earlier evaluation outcomes? So if we know that something is proven to work in a specific context, for example, then, but that's exactly the evidence-based SciComm approach. Very true, very important. Yeah? I mean, obviously we're not there at all. Lynn Dipdal saying she would like to problematize the drastic increase of scientific publications the latter years, while researchers argue they don't have the time to communicate their research to a larger audience. I also question that researchers keep coding their research into a language that makes their publications inaccessible. That's the jargon issue. I will never be out of work decoding all the papers from my research colleagues, yeah. There are already apparently comments on the LinkedIn page. See all the things we're missing here, at least I am. So, dear colleagues, I think we should probably call it a day. Let me thank the organizers of the Swedish Science Communication Forum very much indeed for giving us the opportunity to share some results and also to engage with you as a community about this. It was a great pleasure, always great fun. Let's catch up afterwards. Let's stay in touch. If you have any further questions or ideas, let's follow up. That doesn't have to be the end of the discussion. Thank you so much for sharing all your experiences and your ideas. We'll be coming back to you, and otherwise enjoy the day wherever you might be in the world, and talk to you hopefully soon. Thank you very much for joining and for your contributions.